Today we're going to talk about the infamous murder in Cabin 28. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. In 1979, Glenna, who went by Sue Sharp, left her abusive husband and moved herself and her 5 children from Connecticut to California. Initially, the large family rented a trailer that was owned by Sue Sharp's brother, but they just couldn't all fit in there comfortably. But her luck would change in September of 1980. Sue Sharp found a larger home in Keddie, California. Keddie was once a really bustling town due to its railroad terminal, but eventually many of the residents left once it was closed, and the town basically fell into despair. So they would try to rebrand it as a resort town and have people come hiking and fishing and just enjoy the outdoors. And that revival really didn't help either. A man named Gary Moloff owned a few of these failed resort cabins, and one of those was Cabin 28. He actually turned these cabins into long-term rentals for low-income families. And although the cabin that Sue Sharp would rent from Greg was pretty run down, it did provide her and her family with much more room, and she really liked that it was in a wooded rural setting. She wasn't in the busy city, and she didn't really have to deal with all the chaos that comes with that. Sue Sharp's neighbors would describe her as a loner. She really didn't make friends in the community. She did have one friend, but that seemed to be it. She was attending business classes at the community college and was a really good student who worked hard. She did maintain her high grades, and she really didn't have any police records. So she was an overall quiet, kind person who just minded her own business and took care of her children. On April 11th, 1981, Sheila slept over at one of her friend's house, and that was really just down the street from her own home. John and his 17-year-old friend Dana had actually hitchhiked to a nearby party, and they would return home later that evening. Tina had actually briefly joined her sister at her friend's house before coming back home that night, and at her home was obviously her mother Sue, Greg and Rick, and one of the neighborhood boys known as Justin Smart. As mentioned, Sheila Sharp had spent the night at her friend's home the previous night, and she had actually forgot her church clothes, so she was just gonna run back home really quick, put on her church clothes, and then go back to her friend's house. Unfortunately, when she got to her family's cabin, number 28, she would walk into a grisly crime scene. At about 7:45 a.m. that morning, she opened the door and she would find the bodies of her mother, her brother John, and his friend Dana. And they were just covered in blood. There was blood everywhere. She immediately left the cabin and ran to a neighbor's house to get help. There's some conflicting stories I've read here. I heard the neighbor comes back and he actually removes the 3 boys who were in the bedroom from a window so they didn't have to see the crime scene. But I've also read that police came and they found the 3 boys in the bedroom. So I'm not really sure which one is true. So authorities arrived and they would confirm that Sue, John, and Dana were actually deceased. They had been dead. But it would take them hours before they realized that somebody in the family had been missing. 12-year-old Tina wasn't in the home and they didn't know where she was. So John was closest to the front door. His hands were covered in blood and were bound with medical tape, and his throat had been slit. His friend Dana lay beside him on his stomach, and it's believed that his head was bashed in with a blunt force object. He had also been manually strangled. His ankles had been tied with electrical wire, and it had actually been tied to John's as well, so it connected the 2 of them. Sue had actually been partially covered by a blanket, and she was naked from the waist down. She was gagged with a bandana and her own underwear, which was secured with medical tape. She apparently had injuries that were very consistent with a struggle, and she had an imprint of the butt of a pellet gun on the side of her head. And like her son, her throat had also been slit. Apparently all of the victims had suffered from blunt force trauma, which was inflicted upon them by a hammer, and all of them had sustained multiple stab wounds. There's also a bent steak knife on the floor. There's also a butcher knife and a bloodied hammer side by side on a small wooden table near the entry to the kitchen. So apparently the 3 younger boys that were there that night, Greg, Rick, and Justin, who was the neighbor, had been untouched, and they actually slept through this horrific crime, which is strange because a woman and her boyfriend in the cabin next door heard what they described as muffled screams at around 1:30 a.m. that morning. But they really didn't know where they were coming from, so they didn't call the police, and instead they just went back to bed. And initially the boys did claim that they slept through this massacre. Apparently Justin Smart came forward and said that he saw Sue with 2 men that night, one who had long hair and a mustache, and the other was clean shaven with short hair, but they both had on glasses. And one of those men had a hammer. And apparently Justin Smart began to have vivid dreams about the murders, and basically he said that one of the men had a hammer, the other had a small knife, and Sue was talking to the men when John and Dana arrived home, and then obviously the discussion erupted into a violent attack. He said that one of the men ended up stabbing Sue Sharp, and he said that Tina had come out of her room during the struggle, but was carried out of the house by one of the men, and he came back inside without the girl. And obviously, this crime scene was just incredibly violent. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, the floors, on the victim's feet, the bedding in Tina's room, the furniture, the ceilings, the doors, the back steps. It was just absolutely covered in blood. And investigators said that they believe that the bodies had been moved and rearranged after the murders just because of how much blood there was and the fact that it was just all over the place. They don't believe that forced entry happened. There was no sign of forced entry, but they did find an unidentified fingerprint on a handrail of the back stairs. The phone had reportedly been left off the hook, all of the lights had been shut off, and the curtains had been drawn closed. And when there was still no sign of Tina, the FBI would become involved. So basically, based on Justin's descriptions of the murderers, detectives identified 2 suspects, one of which was Justin's father, Martin Smart, but he went by Marty. So the police obviously interview him, and he actually tells them that Sue and his wife were enrolled in classes together at the college. He also told authorities that he had a hammer and that it went missing. It's a really odd statement to make. But Marty's wife, Marilyn, actually found a bloody jacket in the basement of their house, which she firmly believed belonged to Tina. And apparently she gave this jacket to authorities, but there's no record of it. And she also provided a letter to police that Marty had written her, where it seems like he confessed to these cabin murders. The letter stated, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Great. What else do you want?" Apparently, Martin Smart had a house guest who was an ex-convict. His name was John Bowe, and he was well known to have connections to organized crime in the area. And apparently, both men had been seen that night in suits acting oddly at the bar. Apparently, later that year, a knife was actually recovered in a trash can outside of the Keddie General Store, and they believe that knife was also linked to the crimes. A lot of people believe that the sheriff that handled this case was actually quite corrupt. Apparently, Sheriff Thomas had actually called the Sacramento Department of Justice, and they sent 2 special agents out, but not homicide agents. They were actually agents from the organized crime unit, which is pretty odd when you have a murder of 3 people. Sheriff Doug Thomas stated that Martin had passed a polygraph test, but it was later confirmed that Martin Smart and Sheriff Thomas were actually friends. They had a close relationship, although the sheriff denies this. In a 2016 interview, Sheila Sharp said, "I was told the suspects were told to get out of town, so to me that means it was covered up. And it also seems like evidence was covered up. If Marilyn had actually seen that jacket and turned it into police, where was the jacket? It seems like somebody had covered this crime up, and the person who could do that is the sheriff." Apparently, Martin Smart actually fled to Nevada, where he would confess to these killings to a therapist. He said, "I killed the woman and her daughter, but it didn't have anything to do with the boys." Obviously, the DOJ was alerted to this confession in 1981, but they dismissed it as hearsay. And then 3 years after the murder, someone collecting bottles in the woods about 100 miles away from the Keddie cabin found human remains. And those remains belonged to Tina Sharp, the 12-year-old who was missing. Near the remains, detectives apparently found a child's blanket, a blue nylon jacket, a pair of jeans with a missing pocket, and an empty surgical tape dispenser. And then a mysterious phone call would come into police. The person on the phone would say, "I was watching the news and they were talking about the girl found at Feather Falls. I was just wondering if you thought of the murder up in Keddie and Plymouth County a couple years ago where a 12-year-old girl was never found." Investigators would theorize that whoever made that call knew more than they had let on to. But apparently this call was never initially investigated. So of course, like any unsolved case, there's a lot of theories about what happened. Apparently Marty Smart had lived next to Sue Sharp, and him and his wife Marilyn were receiving marriage counseling from Sue Sharp. And apparently these counseling sessions really upset him. He believed that Sue was trying to meddle and to get Marilyn to leave him. And it later came to light that Marilyn, Marty's wife, and the mother of Justin Smart, had left her husband the day of the murder, which gives Marty Smart plenty of motive. His wife decided to leave him, so he goes and kills Sue and most of her family. And remember, those 3 boys were left untouched. And if Marty Smart was the suspect, it would make sense as to why the boys in the other room weren't touched, because Justin could identify his father, and 2, obviously he didn't want to hurt his son. Some theories also point to a love triangle between Martin, Marilyn, and Sue. It was believed that Martin and Sue were having an affair and that Sue was reportedly counseling Marilyn to leave her husband. And Sue would tell Marilyn that Marty is abusive, you need to leave him. Apparently when Martin discovered this, he enlisted the help of Bo, who was supposedly a mob enforcer, and he lived in the Smart house. 10 days before the murder, he was still living there, and they decided to go to Sue's house and murder her. This may explain why Marilyn left her husband the day of the murders, and it would make sense as to explain why the other boys in the room were left untouched. Because again, Marty Smart wasn't going to hurt Justin, and obviously he wasn't going to go in that room and get noticed by Justin. And it also kind of gives context to that letter. So if Marilyn found out about the affair between Martin and Sue, obviously she's going to be enraged, she's going to be hurt. She's going to be upset. So he writes her a letter and he says, what else do you want me to do? I got rid of them. So he killed his lover in order for his marriage to survive. Both Martin and Bo are actually deceased, but new DNA evidence has pointed investigators to other suspects. And they don't believe that Martin and Bo are innocent per se, but they believe more people had a hand in this crime. One of the officers working the case said, it's my belief that there were more than 2 people who were involved in the totality of the crime, the disposal of the evidence, and the abduction of the little girl. We're convinced that there are a handful of people that fit those roles who are still alive. And the former county sheriff, Greg Hagwood, actually said that he believes Tina is central to why this crime happened. In an interview, he said, you kill 3 people in a cabin and you leave the remains there to be discovered. I think there is something about Tina that could not be left there to be discovered. It's my strong sense that there's something about Tina that did not allow for her to be left there. So I would love to know what you guys think about this case. I would love to hear some of your theories. I do feel like Martin and Bo had a part in this, but I do believe there's other people there. And I do agree that there's some reason why they kept Tina alive. They removed her from that house for a reason. And that really actually bothers me about this case. I really don't understand why they removed Tina and why she was murdered elsewhere and found 3 years later. So I'd love to hear your theories in the comments. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Be sure to check out some other videos on the channel while you wait for my next upload. And if you have suggestions for a case, pop them in the comments and I'll get to as many of them as possible. See you next time.